Oh, hello and welcome to the third webinar of this series on environmental peace building and science diplomacy. So we had two webinars already in the series, and I would like to first introduce myself and then go on to talk about what we already discussed in the past two webinars. So my name is Dhanashree Jairam, and I am a co-coordinator and assistant professor at Center for Climate Studies at Manipal Academy of Higher Education. I'm also a research fellow at the Earth System Governance Project. So what are the objectives of this webinar series and what we have already discussed? Some of the objectives are, of course, to discuss the interface between science diplomacy and environmental peace building, also talk about these concepts at the individual level and not really as mutually reinforcing as such. But how are they linked? Are there any common goals? If yes, what are they? What are the critical perspectives to these concepts? What are the stakeholders and initiatives spurred by these concepts? Are there successful cases of science diplomacy and environmental peace building across the world? So these are some of the issues that we have been discussing. So the first webinar was in fact held in April. And the second webinar was held just last week. So in the first webinar, we had two speakers who are engaged in Science for Peace initiative in Cyprus. So from both sides of Cyprus, from the northern and southern parts of Cyprus. In the second webinar, we talked about polar regions, the Arctic and Antarctic. And in fact, one of the speakers who was instrumental in driving the adoption of the world's largest marine protected area in the Ross Sea, Antarctica. So we've had wonderful conversations and discussions on these concepts, on these aspects of science diplomacy and environmental peace building already. And today we are in fact going to talk about oceans governance and to some extent even dispute management. So we have two speakers. Dr. Leandra R Gonçalves, who's a postdoctoral researcher at the Oceanographic Institute, University of São Paulo, Brazil, and James Borton, faculty associate at the Walker Center, University of South Carolina, United States. So welcome to both of you. Leandra will be talking about in general about interactions between the sciences and decision-making across borders, and at the same time interface between knowledge and power in this context, etc. But she will also be particularly focusing on the regulatory framework for the Brazilian exclusive economic zone. James, on the other hand, will be talking about marine conservation cooperation and confidence building steps towards science diplomacy to address environmental security in the disputed region of the South China Sea, where there is a lot of environmental destruction already taking place, also to some extent fueled by the dispute itself. Let's also not forget that we are talking about this issue at a time when we are being constantly reminded about the rapid pace at which the planet's species are becoming extinct. So the recently released report of IPBES on biodiversity, in fact, says that as many as 1 million species, both plant and animal, are facing extinction. And marine biodiversity, in fact, faces extreme risk from environmental and climate change. So it's a very, very opportune moment. It's a very relevant moment to talk about these issues, especially from perspective of science diplomacy and environmental peace building, especially in areas where you have countries or that are at conflict with each other. So let me introduce Leandra first and then invite her to present her talk. Leandra Gonçalves is a PhD in International Relations at University of São Paulo in Brazil. As a research fellow for the Earth System Governance Project, of which I'm also a part, she's working with other colleagues for the development of a Painel Mar in Brazil with the general aim of bridging knowledge networks for better ocean governance. Also, on the international level, she's part of the Ocean Governance Task Force with other colleagues, which seeks to address the daunting multi-level challenge of oceans governance in the Anthropocene. So it's over to you, Leandra.
Thank you, Dana. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Thank you. And well, good morning, everyone. At least it's good morning for me. I don't know where the people from the audience is. It's a pleasure for me to be here and sharing the work and my view on this science diplomacy. I have to say that this this area for me came into my my life once I have been working for some environmental NGOs and trying to build bridge between the science and policy interface on national and international level. And then I apply for a summer course promoted by the Advanced Academy of Science in the World Academy of Science that was discussing this science diplomacy context from the theoretical and also from the empirical point of view, which was very interesting approach for me to advance what I was living here in Brazil. So what I want to do in my presentation today is to provide some theoretical background on science diplomacy, and then to inform you about the process that I have been engaged in facilitating here in Brazil about ocean governance. So I want to share my screen with you right now. Let's see if it's going to work. Is it working for everyone?
Yes.
Okay, good. So what's science diplomacy? We normally divide this concept in three different categories. That one would be science in diplomacy, where we would include the global issues with science basis. That is normally like climate change, global health, sustainability, energy, and that topics that need scientific and technical aspect of formal diplomatic process. So it's an idea where you have a very technical and complex issue that you need science to inform the policy making. The second category would be the diplomacy for science, where we have formal diplomatic means to achieve scientific goals. That would be like partnership between countries to achieve a scientific goal. So we have like one very clear example for me is our state scientific agency from São Paulo that have agreements with other scientific agents in different countries where they can put research together to discuss environmental topics, for instance. And we also have this science for diplomacy, that is when we have international engagement through science to develop, sustain, and enhance relationship between countries. So we normally use these three categories when we want to explain what science diplomacy means. And do we need the science in diplomacy? I think the most important aspect for this topic is that today, if we look into these issues we have to deal with, most of them are very complex and they are not really contained within the territorial borders of the countries, within the sovereignty territory of the countries. We have many issues that are completely interconnected, and we have science, engineering, and technology as part of this cause or part of the solution. So the world is completely interconnected, and we have many examples of that. We have all those impacts from the climate change, like ice melting, or even on the impact side, we have this CO2 emissions, and those impacts from the climate change, they do not respect the territorial borders. If Brazil is burning the forest for agriculture, the emissions we have here is part of the emissions we have for the whole planet. And if we have climate change impacting Antarctic territory, for example, the ice melting is also helping to, is also affecting and influence the sea level rise that is impacting the coastal cities here in Brazil. So the world is connected not only in terms of globalization and economically speaking, but also ecologically connected as well. So this would be a picture that shows how Brazil, even far away from many other countries, when we are discussing our national policies for Amazon protection or for development of our agriculture, this also affects whichever aspect of quality of life and way of life from different other countries. And that's why, like, Amazon topic has becoming very important and significant issue for many different countries, even far away from Brazil. It is important to put this discussion in a context of Anthropocene, which has been a very famous concept, but that basically means that the impacts of human the impacts of human activities, human activities in the world and in the planet also has been causing geological footprints. And this is what we have been calling as Anthropocene. Of course, the concept has been very famous and discussing broadly between different disciplines from natural and social sciences. But what this really means is that the human activities has causing impacts that are really dramatically in leaving these permanent footprints. How we can work, how we can live, considering the safe operating space for humanity. So there's this group of research that have been since 2009 studying and researching what would be the safe operating space for humanity, identifying and quantifying what would be this planet boundaries that must not be transgressed and could help prevent human activities from causing an acceptable environmental change. So we have this like chemical pollution, climate change, ocean acidification, ozone depletion, and all those impacts that have been influencing and impacting the quality of life of people, and how we can address those topics under the institutional arrangements we have in place. How we get all the knowledge, the scientific knowledge we have available, and how this can inform policymaking to guarantee we have the safe operating space for humanity. And that's why we need to discuss the global governance of the oceans, because the global perspective of environmental protection involves mechanisms that are not in the sphere of nations. The ocean issues we are dealing now transcend national boundaries and comprise a situation in which stakeholders and different groups interact. What type of issues? We have migratory species, we have energy security aspects, we have the CO2 emissions, and we have now one of the most emerging issues for the global governance of the oceans, that is the plastic pollutions. And with the plastic pollution issue, I'm not just mean the plastic bottles or the plastic bags we see everywhere we go in the world, but also we have a very emerging problem with the microplastics and this is really everywhere, not in the oceans, but in the rivers and also in the air. So how we deal with that? How we deal with this very interconnected world? Like this picture shows us that we have a very connected world under the global maritime traffic flow. So we see here, and this was a snapshot of the world when we show how the ships and the trade is going through the oceans. Shows how the world is entangled with this economic development we are developing through the seas. But also we have this fishery industry, and this is the data from the Global Fishing Watch website, and you can go there and see a snapshot of how or how many vessels we have operating in the oceans in that exactly right moment. So the oceans is connecting countries, states, stakeholders, business, companies, all through their oceans, being through fisheries, being through energy, and being through trade. So how we deal with that, and how science play a role in this very complex process. Since the 90s, we have been increasing the number of multilateral environmental agreements. So we can see this very high topic between 1994, that was the same time we had the Rio 92 conference on environmental sustainability, and this has been creating even more interdependence between countries. So here we have states that are connected through economic development, through ecological connections between the biophysical world, and we have also countries connected through the multilateral environmental agreements that they have signed and ratified over the years. And how we deal with that when we mean securitization of the environment? As we have those many agreements that have been increasing over the past years, we see that the state of the environment has been decreasing. So just this week, the Intergovernmental Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services has just launched their last global assessment on biodiversity and ecosystem services. And the data are showing dramatic information that the biodiversity loss is increasing, that the CO2 emissions has been twice as much as they were in the 80s. We have data shows that we have now 400 dead zones in the oceans. So all those informations that are scientific information are made to inform the policy making. Are they informing? Because all those data shows that we have a resource scarcity problem. And is this related to conflict? And how we are going to deal with that? Because if this report is showing us is that the societies is completely dependent on environmental resources. It's completely dependent on the natural resources. And this means security of energy, food, and water supplies. In the security of ways of life alters the central understanding of security away from one associated with mitigating threats from other actors and towards one conceived in terms of reducing vulnerabilities and enhancing resilience and sustainability. In this case, when we mean this loss of natural resource, the role of the state as a security provider does not disappear, but it is changing, because the world is also changing. So in this case, what I want to, the point I want to raise here is that we have human security concerns also related to the potential for violent conflict and access to foods, clean water, and the satisfaction of basic needs. And this is totally related to environmental crisis we are facing right now. And national security concerns have focused on the potential for population growth and related resource scarcity to prompt violent conflicts and the security of energy supplies. And how we deal with that under this concept of vulnerability and resilience. And that's why many countries have been discussing how they deal with these policy changes. And sustainable development goals emerged as institutional arrangements to do not leave anyone behind, as they say. So they want to establish those goals. That means cooperation between countries to address all the problems we have, not only in the environment, but also on the society and also on the economic side. If we go back to the traditional formal policy process, we have the cycle of policy formulation, decision-making, policy implementation, monitoring, and agenda setting. This would be our traditional policy process. So what I would like to show you is how we have been dealing with that to create a marine bill here in Brazil. This entangled world of Brazilian marine bill has showing now that all the fragmentation we have in our national arena, showing that we have a fishery policy, marine protected policy, security policy, a navy and defense policy, but all those policies are not talking to each other. The stakeholders are not in the same table to discuss how to promote governance in our waters. So since they are not talking, all the sectors are completely entangled, but they are not really promoting a harmonic policy to integrate the uses we have within our economic and exclusive zone. So how science plays a role here, how we can promote scientific diplomacy in a world where the policies are not really talking or interacting to each other. And what we have done here was to work through the knowledge networks. So those knowledge networks that involve scientists from social science background and also from the natural science background have created those networks of knowledge to speak to ever stakeholders that were in the position of decision making to discuss how would be the Brazilian marine bill, how we could integrate mining policies with marine protected area. And the one solution we came with that has been discussed in another country as well, but that could promote harmony between our users of the oceans was the marine spatial planning. So the idea was to discuss with science users, policymakers, how we could harmonize the uses we have within our EEZ. Is the process working? Is the scientists happy with the process? Are they really involved? Well, it's right in the beginning. But what we have so far is that some chaotic process that is in the middle of a crisis that has to be organized towards a more formal process. So since last year, the government has to had find another way of dealing with oceans and sovereignty. And following the same influence from another country, they have created large marine protected areas. So Brazil, just at the end of 2018, has gone from 1.5% of marine protected areas to 27%. As many other countries have done that to achieve Aichi target under the Convention of Biological Diversity. However, all these areas that are placed in the high seas, there are many concerns because normally they are more a political decision to reach a target other than meet or match conservation goals. So this is the design we have right now for the Brazilians. So you can see those two islands and these green balls that shows how the Brazilian coast is being protected. So all this territorial, marine territorial that are within this red line is our EEZ. And those very, very tiny points in the coast, the green tiny points, are the protected areas we have in the coast. We barely can see them. But we can see those two big balls that were created just recently to reach a political target. So this shows that we are far behind of include science information in our policy making, because normally we have many other variables, including power, that are more preponderant in policy making here in Brazil. And what we have been working now, and it's an ongoing process, is to create these knowledge networks that are aiming to promote science diplomacy in order to guarantee we have more effective policy for the ocean governance in our area. And I think I will leave our talk from here. Let's just stop share my screen.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Leandra, for sharing your thoughts on science diplomacy. You also gave a theoretical background, which is great, because especially for students or academics who are dealing with this concept at a theoretical level, you provided a very good understanding of that. So, and also to the specific context of Brazil. And thank you for sharing your thoughts there. Now, I would like to invite James Borton. I already introduced him in the beginning, but a little bit more about what he has been doing in the field of oceans governance. James Borton is a veteran editor and writer with over 25 years of experience in Southeast Asia. He was an Asia Pacific correspondent for the Washington Times and has been contributing special reports from the region. He is the author of Venture Japan, and has edited 2 books, The South China Sea Challenges and Promises and Islands and Rocks in the South China Sea Post-Hague Ruling. As an ocean steward, he has reported widely for the Washington Times, Geopolitical Monitor, Asia Times, Asia Sentinel, The Diplomat, International Policy Digest, and Project Syndicate about environmental security issues in the South China Sea and in the lower Mekong Delta. So over to you, James.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. First of all, let me express my thanks to the Environmental Peacebuilding Association and to you, our facilitator, and also to my colleague, Leandra. I'm an environmental policy writer who really has been standing on the shoulders of marine scientists for many years. And to that end, this morning, I would really like to have a conversation with you about what I have been doing in Southeast Asia and more specifically in the South China Sea. Ocean governance is without a doubt a crucial issue requiring closer examination in light of the implications from climate change. And this is particularly true in the growing tensions in the South China Sea, related not only to the sovereignty claims, but also to the competition for marine resources, fish, if you wish, seabed mining, oil drilling. But the center of the drama, and I have been out in the South China Sea, is the disputed Spratly Islands, where competing fishing vessels engage in daily skirmishes. Many of them were not reported in mainstream media. In today's webinar, I really want to have a conversation with you about the urgent need for science to prevail so that the results can yield peaceful cooperation, effective ocean management, and environmental security for all parties or claimants in the region. If science cooperation fails, then all of South China Sea's rich natural heritage of marine biodiversity faces dire kind of ecological dangers. Since 2014, we have seen Chinese reclamation of atolls and rocks and destruction of coral reefs, which are the natural habitats for our fish species. In fact, 80% of South China Sea's coral reefs are degraded. Along those lines, the agricultural and industrial runoff pollute coastal regions. Of course, over-exploitation of the marine resources is a threat. The overfishing threatens all marine biodiversity. What we are witnessing is the collapse of many fisheries, and this is going to impact on the lives of at least 1.9 billion people. Since the 1960s, we've seen a decline of almost 50% in those fish species. The land reclamation, the piling of sand and cement on the reefs endangers the recovery of all fish stocks. The focus today is really for me to draw attention to the role of science or science diplomacy to address these ocean governance issues. I'm very thankful to Leandra for presenting her effective PowerPoints in a display of what science diplomacy is. But the South China Sea marine scientists, and I have had conversations with many from the Philippines, Dr. Edgardo Gomez, my friend Dr. Win Chu Hoi from Vietnam, and several Chinese scientists. They're already in conversations about how to head off a major fish stock collapse. What's interesting and noteworthy, and I bring this to your attention because last month, very quietly in Beijing, there was a, under the radar, if you wish, quiet workshop held with marine scientists from all the claimant nations gathered in Beijing to talk about marine conservation and to address the fisheries issue. For sure, the region needs and requires a science-led diplomacy effort to address these environmental issues and to establish some regional joint science authority to monitor the coral reefs and the fish catches and pollution and more. So joint scientific investigations have the potential for sure to enhance trust, strengthening cooperation, and shared interest without involving territorial disputes among the sea that is bordered by what? Brunei, Cambodia, China, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Singapore, Taiwan, Thailand, and Vietnam. A lot of self-interest here. So how does science drive a conversation and how to lead to cooperation? Certainly inclusiveness. Inclusiveness is a key word, and I think it builds trust. Just a few days ago, I had a telephone conversation with the noted Dr. Paul Berkman, who's done a lot of work in the Arctic and the Arctic Council. We talked also about the Antarctic Treaty being a good example of science cooperation. But he is an advocate, a very strong proponent that science contributes fundamentally to the implementation of sustainable development strategies. And certainly that is what the South China Sea requires today, a sustainable strategy. Along those lines of how effective science diplomacy can be, we know for sure that the marine scientists in particular share a common language, and that offers kind of a useful and convenient starting point for any kind of regional cooperation. Simply put, science diplomacy provides the parties involved in the South China disputes in particular with a rational and transparent way to avoid the worst while looking for the best in the shared common ground. It is noteworthy that in 2016, the Hague Tribunal ruling on the environment issued a decree, if you wish, a resolution, that there is an obligation to protect and preserve the marine environment. They were referring to the South China Sea. And the ruling adopted kind of an ecosystem approach to looking at the problem and expressing specific need to integrate the management of land and water and living resources to promote conservation. But this approach features heavily in rules, guidelines, and conventions. Unfortunately, China failed to conduct any of these environmental assessments of its own reclamation activity, which draws me to this point in our conversation this morning. I'm feeling more confident that we can see this sense of diplomacy, science diplomacy, and marine science cooperation move forward because of the immediate need to address the environmental degradation that's taking place. Because ultimately, what this is about is food security, environmental security. For sure, there is a growing and looming food security issue with the decline in fisheries in that part of the world. And the collapse of those fisheries impacts, a billion people and more. In fact, more than 400 million people live along the coastal areas. And so with the continuing decline of fish species, we are indeed needing to address the commons being the sea and the ocean. And I see that even though on an institutional level, we wish global level, the Hague Tribunal might have issued this decree, the real promise for science, for diplomacy, is for the nations and all of its citizens to recognize that the ocean is fundamentally a part of the global commons, and it belongs to all of us to conserve and to protect and to sustain. This I know for sure. In recent conversations, in fact, just last month I was in Vietnam and spent time with local fishermen in Da Nang, in Lee Island, where the Vietnamese fishermen go to the paracels. And that is sometimes a perilous journey because often they're confronted by Chinese vessels where the Chinese, if you wish, fishing fleet are still hold state-of-the-art vessels. And of course, Vietnam builds the traditional colorful wooden vessels. It is no match. And unfortunately, in these skirmishes, too many Vietnamese vessels go to the bottom of the ocean. They're sunk. So there's the imminent threat associated with that. In conversations there, I also spoke with several marine scientists about what Vietnam is doing in terms of their marine protected areas. They need and they realize that indeed there is a potential food security issue. So they're taking the steps and measures. I think that that could be an excellent example for ASEAN, for other nations, in terms of the rollout of more marine protected areas. I believe that China recognizes this need for the development of these marine protected areas, certainly born out of necessity to feed their own people instead of their distant fishing fleets going into other EEZs. So I come back to this notion that if the center of this drama rests here in the South China Sea related to, well, conservation of and sustainability, that part of our oceans, then it's imperative that the marine scientists engage in more frequent discussions. And I think we're going to see a kind of ramping up of these workshops because it's continuing to build trust and confidence among those scientists and the nation states that they represent. So ultimately, the outcomes look good from my perspective because we're going to see this kind of intensified joint marine science ecosystem monitoring. And it will apply the scientific results to perhaps the building of a regional ocean management and environmental security team that would be comprised of marine scientists from all the claimant nations so that they all share in the good of the commons. We've seen parts of this as examples. In the past, there's the East Asia Regional Seas programs. There's the Partnership in Environmental Management for the Seas of East Asia, PEMSA it's called, and of course the United Nations Environmental Program, UNEP. They do address environmental protection, and they have been keenly interested in what's going on in the South China Sea. Ultimately, I think in terms of the outcomes of these continuing workshops, it's to engage all of ASEAN to address this crisis, this environmental issue, and this, I believe, will come about. There's always, I think, fear on the part of some nations that they might offend China, but it seems to me that China recognizes the need for cooperation, at least in science, and I believe what I've heard is that China, in fact, is going to hold another workshop in the fall of this year. Again, a follow-up to the one they just held last month, engaging, if you wish, the science diplomacy and science cooperation. So they're acting in good faith. Make no doubt about that. But I also think that we're seeing that there's still going to be divided political camps about whether or not to trust China, and yet in recent email conversations with two Chinese marine scientists, I believe that the workshops are engendering a level of trust that we have not seen in some time. and indeed this idea that science diplomacy is taking root in a regionally contested area, it offers much promise. I'm reminded of something. I made a note here that I read that is very telling, because we bring back this concept of commons. We have to give credit to Garrett Hardin and his significant paper. It was entitled Tragedy of the Commons. It was published in Science in 1968. And of course, it's still widely referenced today. But in that paper, Hardin warned of the unavoidable tragedy that would follow unmanaged use of public commons. And I believe it's so applicable to what is going on in the South China Sea today, for sure. Because, as I stated earlier, I mean, the real promise of science or diplomacy is for all nations and citizens to recognize that the sea is a fundamental part of our global commons. It belongs to all of us. So I believe that in terms of this conversation and wanting to answer some of these questions I see coming on online here, I will just kind of draw this to its conclusion, is that there are examples of cooperation. I believe that the current political scene, geopolitics, if you wish, can be almost placed in suspense, and that science takes its vaulted role here in driving a new kind of conversation, one of cooperation, and I'm really hopeful about this promise. So let me take some of these questions. As in fact, I'm seeing one come online. I don't know if we want to facilitate these or now, but thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you so much, James, for your insights into the South China Sea dispute, where you have an ongoing dispute, and how really science diplomacy is trying to build, or is it really actually building bridges between the country? That's a question that you have tried to address in your talk. Thank you for that. Thank you for that presentation. Okay, so we have a few questions here already from the audience. So maybe I'll just direct them to the speakers, whoever is addressed to. So yes, the first question here is to Leandra. So the question is from Ramu. He wants you to throw some light on the ecological ramifications of oil drilling in the pre-salts of the Sandhills Basin. What are the ramifications of that? You have your expert opinion on that.
Thanks, Ramu, for your question. This is, of course, one great concern we have here in Brazil since the pre-salt new oil reserves that has just been discovered. It is important to say that all institutional arrangements we have in Brazil for the coastal management and maritime aspects are dated from the 88, together with our constitutional act. And at that time, most of our oil and gas activities were from land, and now 80% of our of our oil activities in Brazil are coming from the sea. So this is, I mean, all the political process we have are not ready to all those new oil reserves we have just discovered in Brazil. But the economic situation is completely ready for, because people are seeing these new oil reserves as their salvation, as their economic development possibility. But since they have discovered those reserves, the price of the oil barrel has just been decreasing, even when they were higher, but now they have been decreasing. So I guess country has to discuss with the society, and this is not happening. This debate and this discussion with society, with scientists, is not happening right now. But what they should do is to discuss with society how we are going to shift from an economic that is completely based on the fossil fuels to a more ecological transition, to a world where, well, to a country where we have more efficiency in terms of energy. And Brazil has a big chance of this transition, because today 8% of our energy metrics is renewable. This is much more related to our hydropower. So we have a way to be energy secured by renewable source of energy. But the way we just announced this new oil pre-salt reserves, we're just like we are living old times. However, all the institutional environment we have and all the coastal management occupations we have right now in the Santos Basin is not prepared to drilling all this oil, because we don't have any national contingency plan. So for instance, if we have an accident of oil drilling in Brazil, nobody knows how to deal with. We don't have like a coast guard that will be ready to operate in case we have an unprecedented accident in our waters. We don't have any security arrangement that will guarantee that the coastal communities will be safe in case we have an accident. So I guess, in my opinion, all these new oil pre-salt reserves has to be exploited in a way of promoting the transition of more energy security phase. This would be my opinion.
All right. Thank you, Leandra. So the next, I will be asking two questions to James. I think they're interconnected. That's why I'm just putting them together. So one is from Anand, who is asking, how can science diplomacy reconcile with power politics in regions like the South China Sea, where it's the balance of power dynamics which is steering the developments? And Vignesh Ram, it's a connected question. Smaller ASEAN nations have almost given up to match capabilities with China. So considering China possesses more advanced technology, will cooperation only help countries lose more territory? So that's like the questions that we have. So and I guess they are connected.
Yes, thank you for those questions. Certainly China is recognized as a great power, globally, regionally, and as I suggested in my brief remarks, that it's threatening to the smaller countries, no doubt about that. But again, in terms of both conversations that I've had with colleagues who have sat across the table in workshops with their Chinese marine science counterparts, I believe that in terms of the geopolitics, that China wants to steer its conversation into a new narrative rather than this hegemonic country that is going to take and grab more land. It sees the need for it globally to be recognized as a science leader, and in this case, as a peace builder. And they believe that, of course, they have the resources. They've got, 3 marine science research vessels, state of the art. I believe that we're going to see an increased cooperative effort on the part of the scientists steering this new narrative, so that not so much that China is going to change its image overnight, but it indeed has the basic technology resources and the marine science vessels to invite other claimant nation scientists to come aboard and join them, not only in bilateral, but perhaps multilateral, let's say, coral reef surveys. Maybe we'll be reading about this in the next couple of months. But I believe that that is the kind of consensus that I'm receiving from an increasing number of marine scientists, that indeed these conversations and more workshops will engender China. Yes, it will play a leading role in that kind of science cooperation, but it means that they'll tap down their kind of territorial claims, perhaps.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for answering those questions. The next question again from Anand, but this is to Leandra. How much can we expect in the domain of environmental protection from the Bolsonaro administration in Brazil, considering he has already kind of pointed towards the need to exploit the Amazon, for instance?
Well, that's a very important question. Well, I was just mentioning to James right before our webinar that we are here in Brazil facing a very complex periods in a very serious one. Just yesterday, we had a meeting with the 8 former environmental ministry, and they were discussing how the current administration is just reducing every advance we have had for environmental protection in the past 20 years. So it's a very emblematic process. And it's not just in Brazil. We have this wave in many countries that are going to a very conservative wave, where they are denying science, where they are denying the importance of cooperating with other countries. And with cooperating, I mean scientific cooperation, political cooperation, environmental agreements, cooperating to improve the quality of life in a global way. So here in Brazil, we are not living a different time, and worst, because every day we wake up with a new saying, breaking news that we have something happening and that we have to act. I have the feeling that people are just like paralyzed and they don't know how to act. Yesterday, we got this news that all the scientific funds for scholarship for PhD and master has been cut at 30%. And this is a huge impact for our science and technology sector. So yes, we are facing a terrible period, very conservative one, where people are denying the scientific information in a non-rational basis. So yes, let's see how these actions will reverberate in the next days, in the next months, and how society will react to that.
Okay. Yeah, okay. Thank you, Carla. The next question sorry, thank you, Leandra. Actually, the next question is from Carla to James here. So my question is to James. As a writer, do you try to engage with common people in these discussions? How is public engagement in ocean conservation developing in your experience?
Very good question. Absolutely. I think I used the word inclusiveness earlier in my presentation, but as a journalist, particularly having just returned from Vietnam, where I, in fact, participated and organized something called citizen science workshops, particularly taking place in the Mekong Delta, where there were about 60 people in attendance, and that included local farmers and fishermen, and in fact, women representing various associations in their provinces. The idea is that the local people who are engaged in this case, farming and shrimp farming in the Delta, facing difficult environmental challenges related to sea level rise, of course, the industrial pollution, and the list goes on and on, want to have more tools to address these issues in the form of science, but they want to have a voice, and their voice should be recognized and heard. And as a reporter, I certainly, even in terms of my examination of coastal issues from Da Nang and Lee-Song Island, I've always engaged the locals to find out what it is that they are experiencing in terms of industrial pollution issues, the decline in the fisheries, and the impact on their local economy, their family life, if you wish. I've heard, in fact, I interviewed recently 5 or 6 what I call fishing families in the Lee-Song Island area, and by and large, the husband is usually in his 50s, maybe early 60s. They do not expect their children to be engaged in that industry anymore. It ends with them because it's such a hard scrabble life. And this does not bode well in terms of, once again, the local economy being largely dependent on both the artisan fishermen as well as the commercial fishermen, because there is not a generation that's going to replace them. So, yes, the voices of the local people are essential if you're crafting a story, about science, crafting a story related to the daily life experiences of people and their relationship with the sea. So to answer your question, yes, it's imperative that you get all of these voices and make it inclusive and creating a science story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. James, there's a follow-up question from Vignesh Ram on, so basically he says diplomacy will always have a limit. So informal dialogues, for example, in the 90s led to the Declaration of Conduct, for instance. Do you see a future cooperation model between Southeast Asia and China on environmental issues, given there are no main issues like involved in this domain?
Well, I think I've tried to lay out a narrative where, food security is a huge issue. And having said that, the commons, the South China Sea, even though China has its 100,000 trawlers, it realizes it can no longer plunder that body of water. And yes, it sent its vessels to other parts of the globe to find the fish. But I think at this point, I believe that we're embracing Chinese authorities as much as the scientists. This idea that conservation is essential for not only their future but for regional security too. We know for a fact that if a country cannot have its water and cannot have its food, then that only leads to one thing: war. And no one wants war in the South China Sea. So I think the narrative and the driving force for science diplomacy is in play now, and perhaps we're going to continue to see more efforts on the part of not only China but other claimant nations take the lead with these workshops.
Okay, thank you so much. So, I mean, this is the last question probably that I can, I can ask Leandra. This is not from the audience. Just, if you can also reflect a bit on your work with the Earth System Governance Project on oceans governance. You also spoke about the global governance aspects, for instance. How do you, connect that with science diplomacy, and how do you work with different scientists or different stakeholders, for that matter? How do you involve them through this process? Can you just reflect a bit on that as well?
Yeah, we have, myself and 4 colleagues creating this Ocean Governance Task Force. Our main goal was to enhance and improve the scientific collaboration between the fellows, the Earth System Governance fellows. But since we have been meeting online and sometimes during the Earth System annual conference personally, we have also discussed the possibilities of having us producing a position paper related to a specific topic to try to involve and engage decision makers in this process. In one of the topics we have tried to do that is this emergent negotiations on biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. That is the agreement that has been discussed under the United Nations Convention Law of the Sea. So our idea is to produce these position papers with opinion from social and natural scientists on how this new agreement should look like, based on the information we have from the theory, from institutional diagnostic, from the institutional interplay, and then to go to the conferences and disseminate this position paper, trying to influence the design of this agreement based on the best practices we have had in the past with those analytical point of view. This has not happened yet. This is an idea we have discussed in many occasions. We have some members from the Ocean Task Force that have been following up those international negotiations, and we have write papers together. We have been to the International Studies Association conferences to discuss biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction, and in our step further would produce this short notes, a short position paper to disseminate between the negotiators in the next meeting, UN meeting. This is what we have gone so far, but still we have many steps that we need to go further to really promote science diplomacy under this Earth System Governance umbrella?
All right. Thank you so much for that response, both of you. Thank you so much for answering all the queries. In fact, this recording will be available online. So just in case somebody has missed out on this webinar, they can watch it later on as well. And there will be a blog post as well based on what we discussed in this webinar. So in case there are more questions in relation to what the speaker spoke about, they can post these questions on the blog, and yes, I will direct them to the speakers, and hopefully they will be able to answer them through these blogs or through other social media networks and so on. So hopefully, this particular webinar series has been able to spur some discussion on this theme of science diplomacy and environmental peace building, as it is important to build bridges between science, environmental protection, peace, and all these concepts which we talk about very often. And we need to explore how these could be achieved, taking into consideration various social, economic, political, cultural, and geopolitical realities, as James already pointed out. So there is a lot of things to explore in terms of research and policy related to science diplomacy and environmental peace building. I would like to conclude the session here because we are now 1 minute past the webinar time. But before I do that, let me thank both the speakers once again for agreeing to talk in this webinar and share their thoughts, share their research on various aspects concerning science diplomacy and environmental peace building. And I would also like to thank all the networks, institutions, and other organizations that have helped make this webinar possible. Center for Climate Studies, which is my center back in India, Manipal Academy of Higher Education. So through them, I managed to, bring about resources to think about this idea and trying to put this forth. And I got a lot of support from Environmental Peace Building Association, which is facilitating this webinar, and the Earth System Governance Project, of which Leandra and I are research fellows. So both these projects and associations have been extremely supportive. I would also like to thank the Early Career Researchers Network of Networks, the Young Ecosystem Services Specialists, International Consortium of Research Staff Associations, Network of Early Career Sustainable Scientists and Engineers, and Responsible Research and Innovation Networking globally. So we have quite a few networks that expressed interest in this webinar series, and I'm quite thankful for their support right from the beginning. And in fact, you can see that there is a presence of a huge proportion of early career researchers, and I think that's a very, very good sign that the early career researchers are interested in this topic, and hopefully we will be able to carry this discussion forward in the coming months and years. Thank you once again for joining this webinar, and hopefully we will have more sessions in the future. As of now, nothing is planned, but please tune in if there is more interest in this topic. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dana, for the invitation. It was a really pleasure to join you today, and James.
Thank you again. I welcome this opportunity.
Thank you.